I don't think you have to sit down and say, okay, I will put myself in my film. I think it will come naturally because it's you and you are the writer and you are the creator. The word objective really doesn't sit well with me at all because there is no such thing. All academics tell themselves that they are scientists, that they are seeking the truth, that they are all objective, and I don't believe in that at all. A film is a political statement. I think filmmaking is a political statement. I don't think you can escape it. You can deny it, but you can't escape it.
Hi, I am Moza, and this is the Ajyal Show podcast. Writing and research are the backbone of storytelling, and they are essential for creating a relatable and intentional story. But how do writers create for film? What do their stories, ideas, and themes originate from? And how do they bring their inspiration to the screen? Today, we'll explore the creative process behind writing with a passionate writer and filmmaker who is currently the editor and assistant director for publications at Georgetown University in Qatar. In other words, our guest is an academic writer by day and a screenwriter by night. She has written and directed multiple short films, most notably her internationally acclaimed short film, El Sit, which follows the story of an arranged marriage in a cotton farming village in Sudan. So let's start this exciting discussion with our guest, Suzannah Mirghani.
Hello.
Welcome.
Happy to be here.
How have you been?
Excellent. Very good. Thank you.
So let's start from the very top. How did you get into filmmaking in the first place?
Oh, well, I mean, how far do you want to go?
As far as you can.
Oh my God. Well, if you have time. So I grew up in many countries in my life, but my formative years, the years that I remember, the years where I gained consciousness, 2 to 7. I was in London with my family. My family had just moved there from Sudan. And so television was a big deal, right, in the house. This is like the 80s, TV, you come home from school and you're watching cartoons and films and whatever. It's the first time I saw Jaws, that was a big moment in my life. And then to be able to watch classic films as well. So sometimes, this is a time where it's not like you can watch Netflix now and have all this choice. There wasn't so much choice. So you saw whatever was on TV. So I even remember watching Casablanca, for example, as a child and liking it. And then my father said, Yalla, we're all going to Sudan. We're moving back at some point. And so I was like, can we take the TV with us? Obviously.
How old were you then?
7. So I wanted to take the TV, and he's like, yeah, of course we're taking the TV. But in my mind, the TV comes with everything that's on it. And so one of the greatest disappointments in my life is when we come to Sudan and first of all, there's no electricity. But then second of all, when the electricity comes back and he plugs in the TV and we're waiting for channel 4 and we're waiting for channel 2 and they're not there. And I actually remember this is like a very traumatic moment in my life where there is no television. That television did not come. And so at the time, my mother had recorded lots and lots of television for us because she knew what was lying ahead. And so we had so many VHS tapes, and I'm so grateful to her to this day that she had recorded all these films and programs and cartoons and what have you. And we wore out these tapes for the next few years. We would watch them over and over and over again. And sometimes the films would even be divided on different tapes. And so to this day, I actually thought that Psycho was Psycho Part 1 and Psycho Part 2, because I watched them in 2 different parts. But that's how I got into the love of the visual, right? The love of the audio visual, the love of film. Cinema itself, like going to the cinema, wasn't something that I necessarily did very often. But in Sudan, we had open air cinemas, which was a whole different experience with Hindi movies. But that's a short introduction to my love of film.
And from there, how did you get into writing?
That's a great question. Also in Sudan, so we're four daughters, and my eldest sister is a natural born writer and artist, and we emulated everything that she did. So she used to write poetry and diary. She had a diary, therefore we all had diaries. She used to write poetry, we wrote poetry. And so just the act of writing gives you practice into writing. So I used to write a lot, just short pieces, poetry, diary was very important. And then you get better at doing it. And then you start thinking that, this is something that I can actually show others, not that diary that you actually have under lock and key. And so it was literally just our own interest with writing. So I didn't necessarily take writing at school at the time, but I loved literature. We had a collection of 24 classic novels. They were all hardbound, and again, we wore those out just reading them. And reading is as much a part of writing, because you have to. The more you read, the more your imagination is sparked. The more you learn different styles of writing. So all the classic novels really kind of like fired up that interest in writing, but never published, right? So sometimes just sharing it with your friends for me was like publishing, right? Because you get another opinion, you get other eyes onto it, and criticism. Right? Some people will come back with a critique of your work, and you have to take that, and you have to think about that, and you have to, at various times, if it's something really personal to you, you might get upset about the feedback. But then the more mature you get, you understand that it's all subjective. People have their own different opinions. Some things you take, some things you leave, even to this day with script writing and with mentorship and all that. But you have to have a core that you believe in. If this is a story that you have written, it's come from somewhere. It's come from some kind of inspiration, which means this can never be wrong. It's just how to do it.
I'm curious, did you write in English or Arabic, especially in your early years?
I have never written in Arabic. I wish. I really wish. No. It's always been in English. My mother's Russian as well, and I've never been able to either read or write in Russian properly. I mean, I do a little bit, and to my mother's great chagrin, she is like, do you know that the Russian novelists are the best novelists in the world? She's always giving me these books, and she's trying to make me read Tolstoy in Russian, and I just can't do it. But I wish I could read in Russian, and I wish I could read in Arabic.
And would you say, in that sense, your upbringing was culturally influenced from English culture, or Sudanese, or Russian, or a mix of
all three and more? So my mother really tried really hard to instill in us a Russian culture, not just a Russian culture in terms of behavior or dress or food, but that too. But the really deep-seated love of literature, of classical music, of the highbrow arts. My mother loved ballet and all this. So that was one side of it. And then being in Sudan and being immersed in traditional songs, Aghani Banat. I love Aghani Banat, which is traditional girl songs. And just stories, oral histories, oral stories. My grandmother, my Sudanese grandmother, was a great orator. She was blind, but she would write poetry in her head and read it to us out loud. So yes, so we have a great love of writing, of reading, of poetry.
And would you say that love that you cultivated throughout your childhood and upbringing of poetry, of writing, of just like cultural productions in general and filmmaking as well, did that translate into you pursuing that field academically?
Yes, but after a kind of roundabout, for some reason, don't ask me why, for some reason I wanted to be a geologist. So my first love was geology in terms of the study. I loved rocks. I wanted to know what was inside them. I loved volcanoes. There was something incredibly powerful and passionate about volcanoes, and I wanted to be a volcanologist.
Have you ever seen any volcanoes for you to love them that
Real
much?
volcanoes? No, I have not. But reading about them, reading about how volcanic eruptions actually create the world. learning that Hawaii is volcanic ash solidified. You know, these kind of things really captured my imagination. And I think I was in love with the romance of geology more than the actual physical, chemical part of geology. So I went to study. I went to study geology at the University of Hertfordshire, and I was so out of my depth. I was like looking at compounds and chemistry and all the things that I realized that these are hard sciences, and I was in love with the romance of volcanoes. So this wasn't going to happen. So I quit after the first year. And I went to study something that was more creative, which was communications, advertising, something that combined copy and visuals. So it was something that I thought I really didn't know what I wanted to do at the time, but I thought that this is good enough because it has visual elements in it. It has creativity. I can come up with these slogans and jingles and things like that. So it's part of my advertising studies is where I came across film history and film studies. And one of the courses was actually filmmaking. And that was back in the day when it was on film. So it wasn't even digital. And I really, really loved it. Film history especially, I was absolutely captivated by the classics. So up to this day, like 1940s specifically, film is my favorite time period. Sorry, I went off on a tangent there.
I know, I think you answered the question, and just to link it to what you're doing right now. So how did you end up in academic writing from a more creative background, and then maybe how it links to your current work in creative industries?
Yeah, so the advertising was fine. Then I went in to do a master's, and I did master's in communications and media studies, which was kind of an extension of that. And then once you get into a master's, you start writing academically. You start writing, you have a thesis to write, you have to think about it more structurally, you have to have an argument. So once you start writing the thesis, I really enjoyed that process of argumentation, that process of citation, the process of research. I found how much I loved research. And then I couldn't get enough of it. I wanted to do a PhD. So I did a PhD in communications and media studies as well. And I just loved the act of writing. And I never wanted my thesis to end because I really enjoyed just the research part of it. And it was only after that, so after I had completed my PhD, oh no, I hadn't completed, when I was still doing my PhD, that I met my husband in Cyprus, and we came to Qatar together. And that's when I got a job at Georgetown, and very luckily I ended up in a research center, and I've been there ever since. It's been 18 years.
So right now, working in more of an academic scene where you work mainly on research, would you say that has any connection with your personal creative pursuits, or is it something you just do in the office and leave it there and then go home to do your own thing?
It's 100% connected. You would think that these are separate spheres, but they're not at all. A lot of my films, the research from it comes from my daily work. So, for example, I'll just give you examples. For El Sit, the research for that, which is the cotton, the agricultural life of Sudan, was part of a research project that we had done at CRS at Georgetown about food security. So we do these 2-year research projects that end up in books, and I'm the editor of those books. But during that time, we meet with lots of scholars and experts and practitioners around the round table at CRS. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but at CRS for 2 full days, from 8 a.m. until 5 p.m. for 2 full days, we're talking about research about food security in East Africa, land grabs in Ethiopia, and so on. And so once the topic of cotton came up, and I really related that to my family, to Sudan, to the cotton fields of Sudan, to the history of cotton of Sudan, and just wanted to research it more. And the more I got into it, the more I started thinking about the people, right? Who are the people that live there? How would they think about these developments? And from there was the spark of El Sit. And to really just make sure that it's grounded in a really real politics and real economics of agriculture. So that's just one small example. But yes, there's a pure, clean connection between the research that I do during the day and the films I make at night.
And would you say your approach differs when going into a project that's more academic? Because I imagine that is like more structured and you know what you have to get done and how many pages and how many words and all of those things, versus a more creative medium where you have your freedom to do whatever you want and you don't necessarily have to fit within a very defined box, such as in research papers.
I still think the core is the same. I still think that these are, even writing academically, for me, is still a creative process because you're using language, you're using words. And I've been accused sometimes of using flowery language, sometimes poetic language in an academic setting. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be so dry and so boring that you can't attract people's attention to the writing itself, not just to the subject, but to the way you're writing about it. So I actually like to write in a creative way, even though it's an academic article, for example.
And would you say the end goal of each project would be different for you when comparing something academic to something creative?
Not necessarily, because you're publishing, you're screening, you're showing something to the public. So for me, it's kind of the same. It's not necessarily exactly the same process, but the outcome is that you are displaying your work, whether it's academic work or creative work, to an audience. And that's whether it's in a book or in a film form, you're asking for an audience.
And just to push back on that, would you think that working on something academic makes you more objective about what you are trying to study, about what you're trying to present to people, versus when you're working on something creative, let's say a novel or a film, where you're trying to persuade the audience with a certain narrative that you see the world through, versus something academic and you're trying to just study objectively what's happening?
The word objective really doesn't sit well with me at all, because there is no such thing, right? That's the one thing that all academics tell themselves, that they are scientists, that they are seeking the truth, that they are all objective. And I don't believe in that at all, because you are coming at it from your certain position, right? It depends on what your background is. It depends on what you're writing and who you're writing this for. You're still trying to persuade someone of something. So no, I don't believe in objectivity whatsoever. I think everybody is subjective. You're subjective in your academic writing. You're subjective in your creative writing.
You touched a bit on writing poetry versus writing narrative in the beginning. Can we delve deeper into that? What's your experience exploring different creative mediums other than filmmaking, let's say just in the written format?
Yeah, I mean, for me, poetry is the basis of all writing, right? It just gives you a lot more freedom. And if you write poetry, you are allowed, you are given that space to be as creative and free-flowing and disconnected as you want. And so that's why I really love poetry. But it's also something that I think can be slightly alienating as well, because it's so personal that not everybody will like it or get it or even understand what you're talking about. So prose is a much more direct way of communicating. And so is script. Script is a very clear, supposedly very clear way of communicating to others, right? You're supposed to communicate this to the crew. You're supposed to communicate this to the actors. So you have to be very precise about instructions, about dialogue. So for me, script is actually more, if you're talking about traditional script, of course, there's many different kinds. But if you're talking about traditional script writing, it's a very direct way of telling others what you want. Poetry is the most free form and the most loved to me personally. But again, it's not something that you can directly connect with others.
So let's dive deeper into your process of writing a script or a screenplay for a film. So you mentioned in the beginning how for your film, a short film, El Sit, you got the inspiration from working on research on food security and cotton, and then you wanted to do something based on that, and that also would relate to Sudan. So now that you have that inspiration, how do you take it and start putting it in some format that ends up being a film?
Yeah, it's a long process. It's a long, long process. I write for a long time. Like, I'm not one of these
How
people that
long?
can just, oh, I would say it took I want to say 2 to 3 years. But that's not obviously not writing on a daily basis. This is coming back to it, putting it away, hating it, coming back to it, loving it, giving it some time. But I like to write for a long time if I don't have if I don't have pressure. So if I don't have someone giving me an immediate deadline, I love to live with these characters. I love to live in this world. I dream about this world. It consumes me for all that time. And so right now I'm writing a feature. Well, I should have already put that metaphorical pen down, but I continue to look at it. I continue to live in it, and I'm fixing words. It's like sculpting. Even though it's done and I have been told not to touch it, I'm still looking at it because I think it's always open-ended for me. And it's never going to be the final script. And you know there's going to be changes in the future. So I just love to dive into that story.
And would you say that once you start writing and looking at it and leaving it for a bit, would research also be part of that process?
Definitely, definitely. So I do both at the same time. So I would read about, so right now I'm doing a lot of reading about colonialism in Sudan, like the British history of British colonialism in Sudan, which is directly linked to the history of cotton in Sudan in terms of industry, which is directly linked to people's lives and how they lived in certain areas in certain villages. So all of this is connected and it sparks an idea, and I go back immediately to the script and I start writing. So for example, the title Cotton Queen, which is the title of my feature now that I'm going to make this year, came from my readings about the cotton industry, which is a beauty competition. So they had a beauty competition every year called the Cotton Queen, and they would crown the prettiest girl in working in the cotton fields or in the cotton mills in Manchester and Lancaster and in Sudan. So this is something that connected them. This is a highly patriarchal, colonial, kind of demeaning competition. But this is something that I read and I couldn't believe it. And I had to go over it again and again. And I thought, this is something that really has to go into the script. And so not only did it go into the script, it's the title of the script.
And when you research, you see a lot of things and you see a lot of documents, especially the British archives, I imagine
Yes.
there's a lot to go through. How do you curate, in a sense, what you want to make part of your story? Because you can't make it comprehensive of all of the colonial history. You have to pick and choose what you want to feature and what you want to disregard from what you've seen. So how do you make those choices?
You just have to, because it's overwhelming. Sometimes the information is so overwhelming and it's so interesting and you don't know what to do with it. So you start dividing, you start writing other scripts. Like it becomes this beast. So I'm writing something about, I'm writing a new script now on the trains of Sudan, like how the British started the railways and why. And so it is overwhelming, and the British records they kept meticulous records, and they have so much, and there's so much of interest that hasn't necessarily been contextualized, hasn't been parsed. Like a lot of people don't know about these things. And so I keep them in folders. I have a folder on trains, a folder on cotton, a folder on women, a folder on, and so I will get to it. I will come back to it. So I don't see it as, I don't see it as wasted or that it's taken me away from this particular script, but just that it's added to something that I will write in the future.
And a more big picture question, does the story direct the research or does the research direct the story?
A little bit of both, honestly, a little bit of both. So I can't now put my finger on exactly where it started or how it started, but just that there were these ideas that formed and merged. And so I knew that I always wanted to write something about my grandmother, who is like a really powerful figure in my childhood as I remember her. And so I wanted to write something about her And it connected beautifully with cotton because old women in Sudan would weave their own thread on a tiny little piece of wood. And that image of just an old woman and a piece of thread from Sudanese cotton is already your connection to a longer, more painful history of the resource.
And once you have that script almost done, because you never finish it, as you said, once you move into the production phase of making your film, do you still have research involved, for example, maybe in how you want to set the scenes and how you want the characters to look like? Or do you get more technical in that sense after you're done with writing your script?
Well, this is the beauty of working with a professional crew, is that this is something that you can now rely on the costume designer or the art director, and they will be able to give you a lot more ideas and information than you can. So, you know, once we, for example, in El Sit, once the story was set and the characters were clear, then the art director will tell you, this is the kind of angareb we need, this is the kind of table we need. And so they are teaching you about what is needed in terms of the physical objects, in terms of the props, and the costume designer is teaching me about how the cotton would be used into material, into fabric. So there's a lot of exchange there as well.
And to delve more into the storytelling part of the film and away from the more like research information or like the historical facts that you want to feature in your film, how do you go into trying to present a story and have the plot and the drama or like whatever character tension you have in the film alongside all of the research and all of the information? Because you don't want it to be like a flat documentary of just showing this happened and this happened and this happened, and you want the audience at least to relate to the characters, to relate to the story. So how do you transform that information and that research into a story that you find interesting and you think that your audience would find interesting too?
I think once you do any research project that involves people, automatically you have to humanize them in some way. So it doesn't matter which industry you're talking about, it doesn't matter which part of the economy you're talking about, there's always a human, there's always somebody there. And so once you boil it down to what this person is doing in this industry, already you have a character. And once you have a character, you have a creative person, right? You have somebody who has agency and ideas and hopes and dreams and maybe makes mistakes. And so then I think it's quite natural to take something as unwieldy as the cotton economy and boil it down to an old woman. It's there is a natural connection. You just have to follow that thread.
And to move to a more general theme of like the themes that you like to focus on in your films, would you say that there are a specific type of stories, a specific types of do you generally tend to focus on history more rather than something more contemporary?
I think it's mostly contemporary that has a weight of history. So I would always like to ground my films in the past. So industry is important. And I don't think you can talk about a person's life without talking about what they do or what their family does or how they earn, or this is really what this is the basis of how they live their lives, what kind of socioeconomic status that they are, what opportunities have they had, and so I love to take a big topic, like a big issue, and boil it down to an individual.
In that sense, you think that the story that you're trying to like the history that you're trying to deconstruct and present to the people would become more relatable, let's say, to an audience that's watching
Definitely,
it.
definitely. I mean, that's how else are you supposed to? And I'm not teaching. I'm not teaching history. I'm just saying that with every person comes this baggage. No matter how much you try to rid yourself of the baggage of your nation, of race, of all these big issues, you can't, because you are a product of all of these.
And do your stories tend to go back to the issues of identity?
Yes. Not in so many words, but I do find myself, not deliberately, but I do find myself talking about young girls a lot, talking about coming of age. And I've noticed this myself by taking a step back and looking at the few short films I've made and thinking, I have a theme. I didn't realize I had a theme at the time. But I do find that period of time the most interesting, at least was in my life, which is the transition from childhood to adulthood. And that's such an interesting, confusing, emotional period of a person's life. And so that to me is the most interesting for me to make my films about girls in transition.
And do you think it's important for filmmakers in general? I don't want to say it's like a duty of filmmakers, but to document their own history, to document their own stories?
I think it comes naturally. I don't think you have to sit down and say, okay, I will put myself in my film. I don't think you have to do that at all. I think it will come naturally. It will come through the film. It will come through the dialogue. It will come through the characters you choose. So I think it's because it's you, and you are the writer and you are the creator. And so you are putting yourself into that story one way or the other.
And do you think that usually becomes a political story, or a story that has some political aspects to it, or has that been something unique to your experience? You think so?
Oh, of course. I mean, if you take the personal as political, if you take your choices as political, then yes, of course, that's going to be interwoven into the story. I think film is a political statement. I think filmmaking is a political statement. I don't think you can escape it. You can deny it, but you can't escape it.
During your filmmaking journey, would you say that there were any instances where you felt that it was more of a dialogue between you and a larger audience that you're trying to talk to, rather than just you producing something and then showing it to an audience, and it's just a one-way street?
So writing is always personal, right? It's you. You're alone. You are the writer. You are the creator. It has come from somewhere, who knows where, inside you. So it's always a personal beginning. So for me, the origins is always personal. But then once you start getting into production, you start getting into editing, you start talking to other people, there's crews, there's cast, there's so many other people involved that it is no longer that spark that you had. It has now become something that you owe to other people as well, because you are saying this is going to be a public document, and it's a public document for not only the cast and crew but for the audience. So I think there's a transition from it being extremely personal to being something that has some regulation as well, right? So there's rules to editing, there's rules to how you make a film in the traditional sense. So all, respect to experimental filmmakers and the people that do things without these concerns. But you are concerned when you're editing a film. How will this sound? How will this look? This is why you have focus groups, or you show it to people before you do a final edit, because you want opinion. You want to see if what you're trying to say is resonating with that audience. Sometimes feedback is too late if the film is done and it's out there. At a stage where you're still soliciting advice, that's definitely a two-way street. With the audience, it becomes talking about the finished product, but you still take on feedback. You still talk to the audience. I mean, during COVID, there wasn't that opportunity, because you're screening lots of things online and you're not necessarily getting that feedback. But now that we have audiences, real live audiences in theaters, you can screen your film and have a conversation. Now, Q&As are also very short and limited, and it's usually the same questions over. So I'm not sure how much meaningful dialogue can occur in these spaces, but at least contact back and forth is something valuable.
Since you focus on topics that I would say would be more communal, like colonialism, like social issues, do you think you achieve something in that sense in trying to resolve a certain tension, or trying to re-narrate a certain part of history, or to reflect on it?
I mean, I can only hope. I can only hope that is what happens. I mean, I know now that El Cid was screened in Port Sudan to a group of women and girls, and they had their own discussions about the film. I wasn't there. I don't know anything about it. It wasn't recorded, but it was relayed to me that they had a full hour discussion after the screening. And that to me is a beautiful thing if it goes out into the world and it has its own life.
So let's talk a bit more about how you found your own voice in filmmaking and in writing in general. How was that journey?
Well, I mean, I say to this day that I don't believe in this idea of finding your voice. I think you can be as creative and as experimental as you want, and try things differently, do things in different ways. So I know that there's a kind of motto in filmmaking about trying to find your voice, and I'm not part of that school of thought at all. I say, let 1,000 flowers bloom. Try on different styles and see what you like, see what you're good at, and do things differently, right? So I'm curious. I'm curious about creativity. So I like to do films sometimes on my own, just experimental films. And then I like to do the more traditional route as well. It depends on how much time you have. It depends on how much support you have. The less support you have, sometimes the more creative you can be.
And for anyone that is into writing or into filmmaking, what would you say is something that you did that they could do to help them find their own voice, in a sense, to find their own inspiration in stories? They might not necessarily have histories or that are like similar to the work you did, but issues of their own that they can rely back onto.
Take a DFI workshop. I mean, that's how I started. So when I was studying, I loved film and it was all kind of theoretical. But it's only when the Doha Film Institute opened that I was able to take all the workshops, the script writing workshops, the camera, the acting, the lighting, you name it, I've taken all the workshops, and then some. So for me, I always say this, and I would not be where I am today without taking all the DFI workshops. So if there are people interested in film and you're in Doha, or even if you're not in Doha, you can still do the online workshops. It's a great place to be, and it's a great mentor.
Thank you, Susanna.
Thank you.
We're very happy to have you.
Yeah, thank you very much.